During this episode, we use what I found out later was terms that are not perfect and kind of antiquated, such as special needs. Those are the terms I grew up with, but of course the field of mental health and disability is always evolving, so keep in mind while you're listening that our terminology isn't perfect.
Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fucked up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis.
Welcome to Occultae Veritatis. I'm Brannigan, Bran for short, and I'm leading today's episode, and today I have with me...
Ood Gallifrey.
And Isis.
Yeah, this is one of our Patreon recordings where we invite cult members to tell their own stories on their own episodes.
Matthew Graville just wanted people to like him. He was on the autism spectrum, then referred to as Asperger's syndrome, but he tried not to let that get in his way despite the difficulties it presented him. People on the spectrum tend to struggle with social communication and interactions, and may have trouble with fine motor movement and coordination. He still managed to make a number of friends, and left an impression on everyone he knew. And everyone knew Matty G. But before we talk more about Matty, let's talk about some poison.
So, what's your poison?
Alright, so my poison for today is Black Cherry Mike's Hard Lemonade. It's probably my favorite flavor of Mike's Hard Lemonade outside of just the standard lemonade. It doesn't really taste like black cherry, it tastes like artificial something, but it's good.
Are there black cherries out there, or is that a modification of the cherry flavor?
I'm not sure. I have had a black cherry, a black maraschino cherry. It was delicious. It tasted like bubblegum. But I don't know if that naturally came from the cherry or from some flavoring being added to it in the maraschinoing process.
Oh, I just did a wee bit of Googling. Prunus serotina, commonly called the black cherry, wild black cherry, rum cherry, or mountain black cherry.
Those all sound a lot better than the scientific name that doesn't sound so appetizing.
Prunus serotina.
Yeah, that sounds like something that's gonna regulate your bowel movements. What's your poison, dude?
Decided to forego the chocolate milk because that wasn't settling nicely. Big surprise. Energy drinks and chocolate milk, not a good combo.
No.
So I'm just drinking a straight energy drink, which is sugar and caffeine and mysterious fancy-sounding chemicals like taurine that I don't know what they do, but I think I'm mostly enjoying the 180 milligrams of caffeine.
What do you got, Isis?
I have some Naked Grape Moscato.
Ooh. I love Moscato.
Me too. It's the best.
That's a type of wine, right?
Yeah, it's like a sweet, fruity wine.
I like the sweet stuff that kind of goes down better than Kool-Aid.
Yeah. I'm the same. I'm not a wine snob. I mostly like the sweet wines.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of dry wines where your mouth feels like pruny after you're done drinking a glass.
Yeah, they're dry because of the way they make your mouth feel after you drink them.
I like to be spoiled by my wines and my beers. By the way, I don't like my mouth being beaten up by hops either.
Person's got to take care of their mouth.
Yeah. Oh yeah, only got one.
The truth is, very few violent acts can be attributed to a person with a mental illness. In fact, the ones who are in the real danger are the mentally ill themselves. They are 11 times more likely to be victims of violent crime than the general population. I believe that we feel threatened by them because we don't understand them. And instead of trying to understand them, we hurt them so that we can feel safe.
Ableism is all around us, often rooted so deeply that it's difficult to see. From segregation in schools, to inaccessibility, to workplace discrimination, to the idea that disability is worse than death, to people risking their kids dying of preventable diseases, ableism is a form of oppression, and it kills. One murder is one too many. Every disabled person killed is one life lost. Someone's happiness, struggles, aspirations, room for growth have all been snuffed out. Lost because their lives were viewed as hopeless tragedies. It's ironic. They have not been robbed of life by, as many people like to say, their disability. In most cases, they are robbed of living a happy life because of society, and because of ableism, and of course, because of their murderers. Disability is not just a single issue either. It is intersectional. 90% of developmentally disabled women are sexually assaulted. People of color and indigenous people with disabilities are also disproportionately targeted for discrimination and violence. Ableism is created by and based on the same power dynamics as that of racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression.
If you work in the field of disability, you should know that disabled people are disproportionately likely to be targets of violence. I was looking at the study, it said something a little bit different. The study looked at referrals to a child abuse hotline, and it found that autistic kids were 2.5 times more likely to have been reported to this hotline because someone suspected they were being abused. And these were only the cases that were reported. The abuse of disabled children so often is unreported. It is hidden, it is ignored, it is explained away. I found something else in this study, and it wasn't the headline, and it didn't make the press release, but I found out that autistic children were more likely to be referred to the hotline, but the abuse of autistic children was much less likely to be investigated. 90% of reports of non-autistic children being abused were investigated. For autistic children, 60%. 6 times out of 10, someone followed up. 4 times out of 10, no one checked to make sure the child was safe. Out of every 5 reports of an autistic child being abused, they threw out 2. It's been shown in study after study that kids with disabilities are more likely to be abused at home. But the people who are tasked with responding to and preventing abuse threw out 2 reports out of 5. Studying violence against people with disabilities makes it painfully clear how ever-present ableism is in our lives. Ableism keeps safety and justice out of our reach. Ableism makes abusers think they have permission to hurt us. When we are hurt, ableism makes it less likely that anyone will intervene. If we look for help, ableism makes it less likely that we will be believed. Ableism allows abuse to escalate. Sometimes that kills us. Many of the people we mourn today were killed after months or years of abuse. Sometimes that abuse was reported, but investigators believed the abuser's story. Sometimes there was a report, and the report was thrown out. And sometimes there was no report at all, but there were witnesses who knew and did nothing. Why? Because ableism tells them that disabled people deserve the violence perpetrated against us.
Back to Matty G. I was a teenager, and 6 years younger than him, when he was living in my hometown of Mount Horeb, Wisconsin. But I knew of him through some older friends as well as coworkers, and he used to work at the McDonald's where I worked. Mount Horeb is the kind of small town where you don't have more than a couple degrees of separation from anyone. It was a bedroom community for the city of Madison, but it still had that quirky small town feel, with things like hand-carved troll statues all over town, and a mustard museum. It still got the trolls, but now it feels more suburban with all the microbreweries and CrossFit gyms.
No kidding, right?
Yeah. Everyone seemed to like Matty, but everyone made fun of him too. I don't know if they made fun of him to his face, but if they did, he put up with it because it meant he had friends. In an interview, his mother recalled him taking his jacket off and letting kids throw snowballs at him, just for the attention. One person who I never heard make fun of Matty was one of his foster brothers. A guy in my social circle named Brandon, known to most people as Cyclops. So named for the obvious reasons, and he loved him like a brother. Another of his foster brothers described him as a loving, kind, gentle soul. I never knew him well, as we were on the fringes of each other's social circles, but I do remember he was always smiling, and everyone who knew him was always happy to see him, One time in particular, which I think was the first time I met him, I was working at McDonald's in the drive-thru at the second window when a car he was riding in pulled up to the window. I was about to hand out the food when one of my coworkers came bounding over, shouting, "Hey, it's Matty G!" Personally, I don't think anyone who is not a dog has ever been that happy to see me.
You know, some people will love them for being uniquely them and they'll celebrate their presence, but some people will take advantage of them and make them into unfair entertainment.
And sometimes also people can be like pretend nice just as like a further way of bullying somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I think I was in like 8th grade or something. I was not a popular kid. I was very much a nerd, and one of my fellow nerd friends, some of the popular like jock guys kept being like weirdly nice to him, and I could tell it was making him very uncomfortable. And it was like I could not figure out what their motive was. You know, they'd walk past him and be like, hey, buddy, what's going on?" And it was the strangest thing. But I mean, how do you go tell a teacher, "Hey, these guys are being really nice to my friend. Like, can you do something about that?"
Or sometimes they're just buttering them up to get them to do something later or just to humiliate them later, like give them that false sense of security.
Yeah, I don't know what it was. They stopped eventually. I guess they got bored, but yeah, kids are the worst. At this point, I should mention that, well, I'm going to be referring to him as Matty G, because in my head, that's just who he is. None of the sources I read referred to him as such, so that may have just been a high school nickname. Like, I can't imagine a lot of people call Brandon Cyclops anymore, but I don't know that for sure, because he started believing in things like Jade Helm, and trans people shouldn't use the bathroom that suits them, so I haven't kept up with him.
Yeah, I think I'd part ways pretty quick too.
Yeah. Anyway, in late summer 2012, I was at my favorite dive bar, the Firehouse, in Mount Horeb, with my friend Nate, who's 6 years older than me. The Firehouse was the best kind of dive. Cheap drinks, greasy food, chill bartenders, and a nice covered smoking patio. It had a real sense of community to it, too, because you'd constantly see the same folks there. There was a couple other bars in town, and I'm sure they had their crowds, but the disaffected burnouts, stoners, and people who just never left town hung out at the Firehouse. Also, EMTs and firefighters, because the actual firehouse was right across the road, hence the name. It was the kind of place that always had a jar on the counter collecting donations for some person or family in need in the pre-GoFundMe era. Likewise, it had a bulletin board for community news and events. Real small town stuff. That day, what I spotted on the bulletin board instead was a missing person poster. I don't know what drew my eye to it other than the word missing being splashed in bright red across the top. Maybe it's just because you don't see them much. I didn't initially recognize the man in the picture, and the name Matthew Graville didn't mean anything to me. For some reason, I pointed it out to Nate, who looked shocked to see it. It was Matty G, he told me. He'd moved to Mazomanie, another small town in Wisconsin, a while back, but no one had heard from him recently. Nate figured he had just left town for one reason or another. No one who was talking had any idea what really happened.
It's always a bit haunting when that happens. It's haunting enough when just somebody that you sort of knew existed, like you knew they went to your school, goes missing, but you never actually had a conversation with them. But it sounds like you've met him face to face a couple times.
Yeah, like I don't want to give the impression that I knew him particularly well, but I regularly saw him, around other people that I knew. So
Yeah, you didn't know of him. You knew him. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Matty had moved to Mazo after reconnecting with his paternal half-brother, Jeffrey Vogelsberg. In time, together with Vogelsberg's wife, they rented a house from a man named Robert McCumber. Normally, reconnecting with family can be a boon, but for Matty it was a death sentence. Vogelsberg was a petty criminal, with a number of small claims court appearances on his record, as well as various other charming crimes, such as intimidating a victim to dissuade them from reporting a crime, disorderly conduct. Yeah, threatening someone by phone, disorderly conduct again with a habitual criminality modifier, bail jumping, resisting arrest, dangerous use of a weapon, theft of movable property, mistreatment of animals, and several counts of operating a vehicle with a suspended license, which ultimately led up to him losing his license. That same day, he was also cited for not properly restraining his child in his vehicle. Speaking of which, that list does not contain most of the other non-criminal charges included in the court records, or the boring underage drinking charge, which is more like a rite of passage in Wisconsin. He was also the lucky recipient of a restraining order, to no one's surprise. When I was doing research for this case, I went to the circuit court records because it's always fun to look people up on there. And I was really surprised at the trove of information I found just on the circuit court website. I was just like, oh, look at all these charges. That is a lot.
Wait, you mean this guy might have murdered somebody? This gentleman right here? Yeah.
Yeah, he's a real winner. For example, the mistreatment of animals charge came from him throwing his dog down the stairs of his apartment. A former landlord also accused him of blowing up her chicken with a bottle rocket. I don't really want to know the details on that one, but I am picturing Sid from Toy Story, just with a chicken instead of a toy.
Where are your rebel friends now?
However, unlike Sid, who went on to have a respectable career as a garbage man, Vogelsberg murdered his brother.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. He's not unique in this. Animal abuse has long been linked to violent tendencies towards humans, but the full picture is a little more complicated than that, because it always is. To oversimplify it, animal abuse is just generally linked to antisocial behavior, which Vogelsberg displayed plenty of. For example, all those crimes I listed a moment ago.
I'm no psychologist, but it seems like if you have the capacity within you to disregard the well-being of an animal and to hurt it personally, that might pass on to people. Like, I eat meat. I'm a hypocrite in that degree. I know animals are suffering because I eat meat, but I want those animals to die a quick and humane death, if at all possible. This guy seemed like throwing a dog down the stairs and blowing up a chicken, he seemed like he wanted them to suffer.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. What you said about he has the capacity for it, and like you, I'm a meat eater, but I don't think I could kill an animal on purpose. Like I accidentally hit a squirrel with my car a couple months ago, and I was pretty upset about it for the rest of the day. Just a little squirrel that had darted out in front of my car.
Isn't it true that all the serial killers, when they look back into their past, they find that they started out hurting animals?
A lot of them, it's true for. There's something called the McDonald triad, which has been debunked by some experts. But basically, it's the idea that a lot of serial killers have exhibited 3 different traits. One of them is abusing animals. Another is arson, and a third is bedwetting.
Wow, charming.
Those criteria were made up mostly by government agents, like members of the CIA and FBI, and not as much by psychologists. So a lot of that can be accepted kind of with a grain of salt. And a lot of that is correlation without proven causation. It's just kind of like, oh, we've strangely found these traits clustering around these kinds of people. Psychology isn't developed or exact enough to know whether they're directly involved, but there's a lot of serial killers that those traits are associated around. But yeah, we don't know if the correlation is the causation. There's some serial killers who they made a point of not harming animals. Like they believed that animals had a higher claim to life than their victims, but they would be just as ruthless to their victims. So, like, yeah, there's a correlation, but the causation is harder to prove.
So the McDonald triad is also referred to as the homicidal triad, and it's based on research that took place in the early 60s by a researcher named MacDonald. And it looks at 3 specific factors that he believed were linked to violence in adulthood. So these are 3 factors that would occur in childhood that he believed led to violent behavior later on. The 3 factors are engaging in arson, torturing small animals, and bedwetting. Now, when he refers to bedwetting, he's talking about bedwetting after the age of 5. So research was conducted after this research, which supported that this MacDonald triad tended to predict violent behavior. There was an association there. Then research was conducted after that showed little or no association between the MacDonald triad and violent behavior. So does the MacDonald triad predict violent behavior? Well, it doesn't appear to in many cases, but one of the problems here is that we're looking at a low probability event. Violent behavior, even though it seems common, like it's featured on a lot of television shows and in movies, it's not really that common when you compare it to how many people there are in the general public. So you're talking about relatively common behaviors, particularly bedwetting. Trying to associate a behavior like that with a low probability behavior is difficult. Now, we do know that arson and torturing small animals, those two factors are associated with child abuse. Bedwetting after the age of 5 has a moderate association with child abuse. So not everyone who is abused as a child will engage in those behaviors, but it's more likely that they will if they're abused than if they weren't abused. So what do we know about the link between child abuse and violent behavior? Well, the risk of violent behavior does increase if someone's abused as a child. So there is a link between violent behavior as an adult and child abuse. So the McDonald triad might not predict violent behavior in the mechanism that a lot of people think it does, like the one we see in the movies and TV when they talk about serial killers or other violent people and look at these risk factors. It may predict it through another causal chain, which is child abuse may lead to those behaviors, and child abuse is linked with an increased risk of engaging in violent behavior. So in a sense, it's reasonable to say that the McDonald triad is linked to violent behavior in some way. They both share child abuse in common, the McDonald triad and violent behavior as an adult. But is there a direct link? There doesn't appear to be. Both appear to be the symptom of something else.
So Vogelsberg claims he and his brother only horsed around as brothers do, wrestling and shooting each other with BB guns. But he'd also hold Maddie's head under the faucet and waterboard him, a fact known to their landlord Macumber, who did nothing to stop it. Vogelsberg also had a 2x4 that he wrote Matt's motivator on, and regularly used it to beat his brother. I don't have brothers, but that seems to be a bit more excessive than just standard brother behavior.
I think my upbringing was sort of rough with my brother. Like, I was a big, strong teenage power lifter, and he was a strong teenage hockey player. And we tussled, we wrestled. Sometimes when we got into big arguments, maybe even a punch or two was thrown. But like waterboarding, using weapons. I mean, I think we tussled fairly regularly for brothers, but we didn't bring out weapons and waterboarding. I think that's past the pale, especially if one brother has special needs and the other doesn't, you know?
Yeah.
And did you shoot each other with BB guns?
My brother shot me with a pellet gun once, but he was aiming at a gopher that was in between us, and we did not pay attention enough in gun safety, apparently, because he shot me in the ankle when he missed the gopher.
Are you sure it's not just that you resemble a gopher and he mistook you for one?
I mean, I do like digging holes, so there is that.
He's a little too big for a gopher, I think, probably.
Most humans are.
Yeah, just a foot or two.
My grandfather has a BB lodged in his cheek from when he was a kid because his brother shot him in the face with a BB gun. so the BB gun's a little bit not quite so bad, but 2x4 is a step beyond that.
Yeah, and waterboarding is intense. I love to remind people that Christopher Hitchens, for years, he said, "Oh, that's not torture. That's not torture. It's not so bad.
Yeah.
It's not torture." And I think he was waterboarded for 30 seconds. Like, I think that was literally it. And then as soon as he was waterboarded for 30 seconds, he gave the signal to the people that were waterboarding that he wanted out. And he said, like, yeah, that's torture. I would have told you anything. I would have told you anything at all. That is definitely torture.
Because waterboarding, isn't it like putting a cloth over your face and then running water on it or something like that?
Usually your face is at a downwards angle, so a little bit of the water flows into your nostrils.
Oh, wonderful.
And into your nasal cavity, so you choke and sputter. It's like drowning for a long time, except you don't do the dying part. You just do the suffering while drowning part for hours on end.
Yeah, imagine it triggers your like fight or flight response, and you just kind of panic, and all you can think about is survival. And that's probably where the being willing to confess anything just to get out of it comes from.
Yep.
Oh, I was just saying, do not want.
It's annoying to me now to read every time it's discussed in the press or in Congress that it simulates the feeling of drowning. It doesn't simulate the feeling of drowning. You are being drowned slowly. If you hold your breath, it has the effect of tightening the grip of this stuff over your face and mouth and nostrils. So it's a smothering feeling as well as a drowning feeling. They told me that when I activated the dead man's handle, which is a simple process, you simply release something, you let it go. I didn't do that. I practically, even though my hands were bound, I sort of, as near as you could, I threw the thing out of my hand. I mean, I really wanted it to stop. And I could swear I shouted the code word, but I hadn't remembered to do anything like that. Everything completely goes on you when you're breathing water. You can't think about anything else. It would be bad enough if you did have something. Suppose they wanted to know where a relative of yours was, or a lover, say. You feel, well, I'm going to betray them now, because this has to come to an end. I can't take this anymore. But what if you didn't have anything? What if they'd got the wrong guy? Then you'd be in danger of losing your mind very quickly, I think. I think I sympathize a good deal more, because as a result of this very brief experience, if I do anything that gets my heart rate up and I'm breathing hard, panting, I have a slight panic sensation that I'm not going to be able to catch my breath again. And I have to drink some water and sort of just assure myself a bit. I'm not like this at all. I don't have nightmares either. But lately I've been having this feeling of waking up, being smothered, having to push everything off my face.
The abuse peaked on June 30th, 2012, when Vogelsberg beat the 27-year-old Maddie unconscious, claiming to believe that Maddie had been poisoning his children. I could not find any more information on this suspicion of his. For all I know, it was just an excuse or delusion to justify beating him some more.
It could even just be like post hoc justification.
Yeah.
Like, this is a guy who has went after people that were testifying against him to get them to change or drop their testimony or involvement in the case. I wouldn't put it past him just to make up some bullshit just to make himself look better.
Imagine being in your own home, a place where you should feel safe, when your own brother, someone who should care about you and make you feel safe, decides to turn their uncontrollable rage against you. Imagine any sense of safety you might have had vanishing as your loved one hits you, like he means it, over and over again. Imagine begging him to stop. Apologizing for whatever it was you did that made him so mad. At this point, you're probably not even thinking about what you're saying. It's all just an involuntary reaction to the pain and abuse. Eventually you black out. Is that when the beating stopped? You'll never know. For you, that's when everything stopped. Did you know it was different this time? Was it any worse than any time before? Were you just unlucky this time? Macumber heard this from the next room over, and again opted not to intervene. He went to bed and slept soundly, waking the next morning to find Maddie right where Vogelsberg left him on the couch, dead.
Jesus. Didn't even make an attempt to, give him some dignity. He just kind of left him there, right?
Yep. Vogelsberg himself had left earlier with his mother and children to attend his wife's graduation from basic training. Macumber chose to call him instead of the police upon finding a man deceased inside his home. Vogelsberg instructed him to hide the body in the freezer, and said he'd help deal with it when he got home in a few days, according to Macumber.
So, did he know that Vogelsberg, murdered his brother, or was he just playing it off like, oh, I don't know what happened either. I just found him here.
That I don't know. I mean, if he beat him to death, there would be some, I have to imagine there'd be some signs, there'd be some blood, bruises, unless that was just normal and he thought nothing of it. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question.
Yeah, and it's hard to know, even if anything was admitted, it's hard to know.
Yeah. According to testimony by Vogelsberg's mother, Laura Robar, who was sitting beside him in the car while the conversation occurred, he repeatedly insisted that Macumber call 911. However, in initial police interviews, she said her son instructed Macumber to wrap the body up and put him in the freezer, and that it was her who asked him to call 911. Macumber did as instructed, wrapping Maddie in saran wrap and placing him in a freezer. It seems that Robar's later testimony was just an attempt to create reasonable doubt for her son.
Jesus. You have the mother playing defense, too.
Yep. Oh, she's not a hero in this story.
Man, that's no. So he was failed by every member of his family.
Even 100%.
Even in his death, he was lied about to cover for the life of the murderer.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and sometimes there folks are at disabled folks are at higher risk actually from their own families abuse, like from family members to the elderly and disabled people. And one of the issues that comes about when it's family taking care of a family member is you have all the stress of caring for this other person combined with all the usual stress of, any interpersonal relationship, so it can come out in just all kinds of terrible ways. It's sad. I have a cousin with special needs who will never be able to live independently, but she's really fortunate in that she's an only child, and my aunt and uncle relatively well off financially. So we never have to worry about her not being well cared for. But I imagine somebody in her situation, she has called Williams syndrome. In a less able family, I would worry about what would happen to her.
I live in Canada. This case happened in America. Canada has quote unquote free healthcare, but I don't think we have properly socialized healthcare. Like, if we did, and if America did, in cases like this, families like this could be supported. If the environment they're in is not healthy for them, they could be assigned to a caretaker who's trained and filtered to be a good caretaker. Like, that could be part of the socialized medicine structure, but the structure we have now is a lot of half measures that just end up failing people on the other end and put them in dangerous situations exactly like this.
We really do. We have crappy healthcare. I wrote a paper on it. I took a class with Roy Romano, and he did a Royal Commission of Health and what should happen. And we're just nowhere near where we should be, especially compared to other countries in Europe. Like, really, we're pitiful. And you know what? I'm sorry to say, the US is worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a friend who's on the autism spectrum, and he's Norwegian, and he's very lucky that he's Norwegian because they have much better healthcare. He gets like a stipend from the government. He also has some sort of card that lets him use, I think, taxis and buses for free, which is pretty nifty. I haven't talked to him that much about it, but like, there's a lot more support, and I think he can also get access to like job training. A lot of cool options that are available for him that I wish were more widespread.
Education, that's probably covered too.
Yeah.
Like, I consider myself somebody that has a few like health problems, but like, even I am seeing the failures in the system. I'm bipolar with a certain history of trauma, and I would benefit, according to counselors I've seen, from about 50 to 100 hours of therapy a year. That would be most beneficial to me. I can afford about 5 to 15 hours of therapy a year.
Yeah. You guys just recently did your episode on invisible disabilities, and my little sister has ulcerative colitis, which is, I think it's an immune disorder is what it's considered to be. And the medicines that help her sometimes, the doses are like thousands of dollars. It's bonkers expensive. And then like, she'll try one medicine and it, maybe it'll work for a while, but then it stops working, and trying to experiment with different medicines and finding doctors who are going to take her seriously. I mean, it's just all kinds of stress and expense, and she's not made of money, so it's difficult.
Yeah, like Matthew here was failed by a lack of proper care and support.
Yeah.
And that landlord, holy Toledo.
Oh yeah. I'm not done yet. As promised, when Vogelsberg returned from Missouri a few days later, the two men removed Maddie's body from the freezer and transported him to a wooded area near the Wisconsin River, just off a highway, where Macomber buried him in an unmarked grave, while Vogelsberg watched. He claimed he couldn't help because of a medical condition. I'm curious what medical condition leaves you able to physically beat someone to death, but unable to dig a hole to put them in.
Oh, that has the same energy as Harvey Weinstein coming into court with a walker and then him just skipping on his yacht days later.
Yeah, for sure. At trial, the prosecutor showed a picture of the thoughtful grave Vogelsberg made for his dog to contrast with the way his brother was discarded like trash. I wonder if that was the same dog he kicked down the stairs. It didn't say.
Jesus.
Macomber would later claim he did this because he was afraid of Vogelsberg, and afraid of what he would do to Macomber's then girlfriend and her son. But he already knew of Vogelsberg's abuse of Maddie before he let them move in with him. He knew what he was inviting into his house. Also, let it be said that my landlord can't fix the water pressure in my apartment, and this asshole's landlord helped him hide a body. Further proof that landlords suck. Remember, kids, A-Lab, all landlords are bastards. They didn't report the death, and it was actually Vogelsberg's grandfather who ultimately reported that Maddie was missing. Weeks went by, and no one but Vogelsberg, his wife, Robar, and Macumber knew what happened to Maddie. And Vogelsberg used threats of violence to keep it that way. Vogelsberg and his family moved to Washington shortly thereafter when his wife was stationed there. The first break in the case came when Robar went to use Maddie's food stamp card to buy some groceries. After questioning, she led the police to Macumber, who in turn led them to Vogelsberg. As I mentioned earlier, Vogelsberg and his mother tried to pin the blame for Maddie's murder on Macumber. During the trial, the prosecutor tore Vogelsberg apart, pointing out how many boxes he ticked on the Hare psychopathy checklist.
Dr. Hare has spent much of his career in a search to identify and understand the behavioral characteristics and personality traits of the psychopath. His recent book, Without Conscience, summarizes this research.
We can describe a psychopath or psychopathy as a clinical construct characterized by a cluster of characteristics and features. And the cluster would include interpersonal characteristics, how we deal with other people, how the individual interacts with somebody else, affective characteristics, feelings, emotions, and other behaviors, including socially deviant behaviors.
Psychopaths are often described as callous, impulsive, manipulative, glib, egocentric, predatory, grandiose, and lacking empathy and emotional affect. In the early 1980s, Hare and his colleagues developed a psychometric test, now known as the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. Consisting of a 20-item rating scale, the checklist measures such things as glibness, superficial charm, conning, manipulative behavior, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, callousness, lack of empathy, impulsiveness. Each item is scored on the basis of explicit criteria contained in the manual. Possible scores on the scale range from 0 to 40. For the average person, a typical score would be 5. Anyone with a score of 30 or above would be considered a psychopath.
I'm going to start with asking you some questions about your behavior when you were young.
A psychopath lacks empathy, and this simply means that it's very difficult or impossible for a psychopath to put himself inside the emotional skin of somebody else. They may understand at some sort of superficial level that this person is going through what could be construed as an emotion by other people, but I don't understand what it is. This is a psychopath's position. Lacks remorse is another characteristic that defines psychopathy. That is, having done something, you don't feel badly about it. Unless one is caught. Now, a psychopath who's caught for committing a crime, the first thing he'll say is, yeah, I'm really sorry I did it, I feel remorse, but only when caught. Psychopath doesn't accept responsibility for his or her own behavior. Usually diffusion of responsibility is the name of the game for the psychopath. Somebody else maybe do it. It wasn't my fault, it was fate, and I'm not really responsible. Psychopaths tend to be impulsive, but in a fairly controlled sense. That is, most psychopaths are not going to do things if there's an external control present. The psychopath standing on the street corner is not going to commit a crime with the policeman standing right next to him. On the other hand, if the policeman is not there, if the external control is not there, then it's possible that he or she will do whatever he feels like doing if he has a chance of getting away with it. Psychopaths don't have long-term goals. Most of the things that they're striving for are short-term, and could refer to as a short-term form of hedonism. Poor behavioral controls is another characteristic that defines a psychopath. These are individuals who are likely to lose their temper very easily, to strike out and do things that are fairly irrational in the short term, but they do it in a very controlled manner. They know what they're doing. It could be a reaction to frustration and so forth. psychopaths tend to be irresponsible, and that means that their behavior doesn't take into account what's likely to happen to somebody else. They will put others at risk. Their own behavior puts other people at risk all the time. This could be in driving, it could be in their personal relations, or anything they do in their general life. Psychopaths also tend to engage in behavior that is antisocial or at least asocial from a very early age, and this continues on throughout most of the lifespan. And by this I mean their behavior is not necessarily criminal in the strict sense of the term, but in fact it's harmful to other people, other individuals. May not take into account the fact that your behavior is going to have negative consequences for somebody. Others are superficial, surface, very, very little depth. Mostly style over substance. And the idea is to impress other individuals, to somehow put them in a position where you can manipulate them and so forth.
Now, the only items mentioned specifically in the article I found were pathological lying and a grandiose sense of self-worth. But it did say there were others. To paraphrase a podcast I don't like, I'm not a psychologist, but I have done a small amount of research. So I'll have a guess and say lack of remorse or guilt was one of them, and callous/lack of empathy was another. Parasitic lifestyle, I think, is a fair bet. Early behavior problems, poor behavior control, impulsivity, and irresponsibility are too. Failure to accept responsibility for his actions seems likely, as do criminal versatility and juvenile delinquency. Each item is scored on a 3-point scale, with 0 if there are no indications and 2 if it's a reasonably good match. I'm not going to take my guessing game that far to guess what specific score he might have gotten. The checklist has a max score of 40, with 30 being the cutoff in the US and 25 in the UK for the psychopath label. It turns out they just don't hand that out willy-nilly. You have to be a real piece of shit before they're willing to call you an official psychopath.
The word psychopath is thrown around pretty loosely. Like, somebody can cut us off in traffic and we call them a psychopath, but like this is a measured scale of psychological traits that they determine it. Like, they do their homework.
Yeah. In the end, Jeffrey Vogelsberg pled guilty to second-degree reckless homicide. Second-degree reckless homicide means there wasn't necessarily any intent to kill, but there was a knowledge that the actions being taken create unreasonable and substantial risk of someone's death. He received the maximum penalty for the crime, 15 years, with 10 of supervised release. In the sentencing, the judge told him that she would have given him longer if she could have. And even as a prison abolitionist, I would agree that if prisons must exist, they should exist to house only people like him.
Like, I only know as much as you've told me in this story, but it sounds like Vogelsberg is somebody that would kill somebody in a fit of rage rather than plan it out. Like, it seems like he just had another fit where he wanted to beat his brother, and he didn't really care if that beating led to his death or not. He wanted to get all his anger out for whatever reason he had.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, Matthew ended up dead. I think second-degree homicide is pretty on the ball for that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you. It does make sense, but it does make you wonder if, he just snapped and he killed somebody. What's to stop him from snapping and killing somebody again?
Yeah, exactly. And I could be wrong. He could have planned it out. Like, he could say, like, "Oh, geez, like, this time I'm really gonna kill him." Like, he could have planned it out, but that's not the impression I got, you know?
Yeah, and it would be really difficult to prove his intention without any kind of evidence. And I know a lot of times, prosecutors will just go with the charge they think they can get, so they don't have to worry about losing a case and having to deal with double jeopardy.
Better a lesser charge and a guilty verdict than a ambitious charge and an innocent verdict.
Exactly.
And I wonder sometimes if, like, he obviously enjoyed violence, or maybe he did move on to killing because he found that enjoyable. Like, yuck, gross.
Yeah, who knows? And considering this was a little over 10 years ago, I mean, to think that he's going to be out in a few years, this guy who beat his brother to death. Yeah, he'll be on supervised release, but, how much does that really matter? Though I crossing my fingers with his criminal history, I would not be surprised if he wound up back in prison pretty quickly. I'd love to think that he could be rehabilitated, but prisons really aren't designed to do that. They're designed to set people up for failure. So who knows?
If we could only have prisons for serial and chronic abuser types who refuse to seek help, I would find that acceptable as someone who would otherwise find the existence of prisons reprehensible.
Yeah, absolutely.
If somebody wants to seek help and wants to be rehabilitated and seems genuinely remorseful for their actions and wanting to be better, I don't see any reason to let them rot in prison. But if there's somebody who refuses help and doesn't seem to have any remorse or empathy for what they've done, like, yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with keeping those people separated from society.
Yeah. Robert Macumber's lawyers tried to get him sentenced to time served for his cooperation, but he was given 4 years after pleading guilty to hiding a corpse and reminded that he has his whole life ahead of him, while Maddie did not. Laura Robar was given a year in prison for knowingly using a dead man's food stamp card, and Vogelsberg's wife was given a year of probation as well as time served for her role in covering up the crime. I've opted not to name her in this piece because I find it probable she was also a victim of Vogelsberg. She filed for divorce on October 3rd, 2014.
She might have been fearful for her life to even mention or not cooperate with her husband.
Yeah, and just the fact that she filed for divorce once he was put away, and was it just because she didn't think she could maintain a relationship with him behind bars, or is that when she felt like it was safe to do so?
I mean, he abuses his animals. He abuses his neighbor's animals. He abuses his brother. He abuses other people in his life. Who says that he would stop at his wife and children? I don't think he would.
Yeah. Vogelsberg attempted to appeal his conviction because unrepentant killers usually do, and it was dismissed for the obvious reasons.
Right.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As the Chief Executive Officer of the ARC, Disability Rights, well, first I want to apologize for my voice. I don't know if I sound as hoarse to all of you as I do to myself, but as the CEO of a disability rights organization, as a parent, as a fellow human being, I really regret that we have to be here today. This is a really difficult but very important day to be a part of. And I really want to thank the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network for organizing the vigil here and across the nation. I've come to this vigil, I don't know, I think this is probably my fourth year. And every year, I hope it'll be the last time, that we won't really need to come back the following year. After all, we have come so far over the years in the disability rights movement, but evidently not far enough. And not far enough on many issues, but none more important than the horrible problem of filicide, of family members killing their loved ones with disabilities. We're here today to remember and mourn the loss of 650 people, 70 of whom have been murdered in the past year alone. Words matter. Words matter a lot, and we're here today talking about murder. Any attempt to call it something else, to sugarcoat the act of a parent, a family member, or a caregiver who kills or attempts to kill an individual with intellectual or developmental disabilities, any effort to sugarcoat it's just wrong. Filicide is never acceptable. It's never justified. It's just wrong. And when we come to talking about the media and coverage of these murders, we too often see reporters painting a picture of a struggling parent with no alternatives. And that's just wrong. Because portraying a case of filicide that way really misrepresents what really took place. and that is a crime of the most heinous nature. When we see that type of misleading news coverage, we need to stand together and call it out in the strongest terms. The victims deserve no less, and the living deserve no less. The ARC and ASAN, many others in this room involved with organizations, individuals who are activists, folks at vigils across the country. Tonight and every day, we need to continue to work to change public perceptions of people with disabilities. We educate the public in the media about disability rights. We help them try to abandon misconceptions and stereotypes that are just way too prevalent in our society, that individuals with disabilities are suffering, that they are in some way a burden on their family and society. And we really need to instead be standing together and affirming the value of their lives, upholding their contribution to enriching life in our communities for all of us.
Maddie is one of many sad stories of abuse. I couldn't find the stats for fatal crime, but people with disabilities are the victims of 26% of non-fatal violent crime, despite only making up 12% of the population in the US. So much of society sees people with disabilities as less than, as separate. Additionally, people with disabilities are more likely to experience poverty than non-disabled people, and thus can find themselves stuck in a position where they cannot escape their abuse or abuser.
Yeah, and I saw this firsthand. Like, people like to believe that Canada's a socialist paradise, but one of my previous employers was a drop-in center for unhoused people, for people like at the lowest levels of poverty. And we had a lot of people in wheelchairs and on walkers and with different sets of disabilities as unhoused people. They couldn't get funding to get new equipment. Like, some of their wheelchairs were broken apart and in such disrepair that they can barely be used, but they don't have the resources to get a new one.
Sad.
And it's shameful. We're one of the richest nations on the planet, and we have homeless people and people with broken wheelchairs and all kinds of crap, and who can't take because they can't afford them. I could go on, but I just have to say it's a shame for a so-called developed nation to have that sort of level of neglect, shall we say.
Yeah, it's not like people say that like world hunger, for example, isn't the lack of food. It's just that the food isn't in the right places. People aren't motivated to spread it properly because there's no profit there.
Yep.
We have the technology and manpower to feed and clothe and house the world like as far back as the 1600s. Like, our level of production met the amount to support everyone on Earth. And our technology and our ability to produce things has just gotten greater and greater since then. And yet, we're at the peak of resourcefulness, the peak of being able to provide more resources per hour per worker than any time in history, and we cannot shell out a little bit of money to support people that need it. Like, we're buying $1 million jets and letting them rust on tarmacs rather than feed the homeless. It's ridiculous.
Yep.
That's why I say it's shame. It's not guilt. Well, it's guilt too, but shame means it's an intrinsic part of the society, and they feel that it is shame.
100%. Like, I take it personally whenever I see somebody bragging about how nice Canada is, because, like, we have our own skeletons that we do not take care of.
Well, what can you do to help? For starters, don't be like McCumber. If you see something, say something. I don't like cops either, but sometimes you've got to call the cops. There's also Adult Protective Services. It's not perfect, but it's what we have right now. Check in on your friends who are disabled or neurodivergent. Don't let them become isolated. Be their emergency exit if possible, loud sirens and all. If you can, donate to local disability rights and advocacy groups. Always be an ally. Marginalized communities have to stick together.
Hear, hear.
And that's what I got.
It's very easy for those groups to become victims of others that take advantage of them. It's going to require more empathy and effort from everybody, but in the end, less people will be the victims of violence and more people will feel supported and loved in society.
There's a term for it. Direct action? Is that what I'm thinking of?
Yeah, I think direct action works very well. Yeah.
Yeah, but just, screw the government, come together as people, cut out the middleman, help each other.
I like that. That's a good way to end this off.
I'm straight.
Matthew deserved much better than he got, and nothing's going to bring him back. We've made that mistake in society already. We didn't support Matthew, and he's dead because of it. I think the best thing we can do from this point is do everything in our power to make sure that more deaths like Matthew's don't happen.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Occultae Veritatis. I've been Brannigan.
I've been Ood Gallifrey.
I've been Isis, the goddess.
Not the terrorist organization.
Exactly.
Right, not them. No.
Yeah. Homework assignment. Check in on the disabled people in your life.
Yes.
That's your homework. Have it done by next week.
Late assignments get 0 points.
Love you all. Have a good night.
Good night.
It's been a while since we had a slam poem as a palate cleanser. As you heard from an earlier clip, the Disability Day of Mourning is a yearly event where the disabled people who have been murdered by their family or caregivers are remembered and mourned. From the 2022 Disability Day of Mourning, this is Fiona Robertson with her slam poem. See you in the after show.
So this needs a little bit of context because most people don't know what this is about. This is called Disability Day of Mourning 2022. The Disability Day of Mourning is a yearly event where disabled people around the world get together to mark the murders of people who were killed by their carers. It happens so often that every year there is a very long list of names. There is a set of archivists who collect these stories, collect the names. They try and find details about the people who were killed, because one of the features of these types of murders is that almost universally the press coverage is sympathetic to the killer, not to the victim. So when I talk about disability rage, this is about the most rage-filled I can do. The world is covered with scars, if you know how to look. The girl outside trying to wash blood from her hands with snow. There are scars where we salt the earth with tears, places talked about in whispers, becoming ghost stories and folk tales where unspeakable things happened. Today, we do not whisper. Today, we speak the unspeakable things, because every year we are back here. Every year, a new litany of names. Every year, a gathering of the dead. This land is covered in scars, every one in absence, a life ended by blood or breath, by people meant to keep them whole. Every betrayal an echo on the wind only some of us seem to hear. In all of Babel's languages, I lived. We only know these ghosts by the way they died, each name given what few fragments of color the archivists could find. She liked to paint. She gave her money to people in need. He loved to dance. She was a light for her friends. He was too young to like anything yet. But mostly what we know is it was so hard for the killer. It was an act of love. He stabbed her because he didn't want her to suffer. He strangled him because he didn't want him to be embarrassed. She killed them because they didn't take their medication. She drowned her because she was in pain. He killed him because he was broken. You've got to understand. It was so hard for them. You've got to understand. Everyone understands. The girl in the garden using snow to wash blood from her hands from a knife still stuck in her sister's throat. The house where a father broke his baby's bones. The pond where a mother tipped her from wheelchair into water. The desert where the boy was found, throat crushed by his mother. But your horror at the starved scrap of a child's body, or the blood-choked elder, eases on hearing the anesthetic words, which turn slaughter to sad for the killer. Understandable for you. They were disabled. Even in their own murders, they're not the victims. There are scars on the land if you know where to look, and we do. We collect the dead like wildflowers grown in concrete and barren wastes, in places where love should have let them grow strong. We collect their brightnesses, even if all we knew is that they bloomed here for a time. There are scars in the world, and we cannot heal what has been broken. We plant the seeds, tell the stories as whole as we can. We grow meadows on graveyards until their lives are as important as their deaths. Each life a blossom of raging color, who should have survived to send their wishes out into the world. So we wish instead for our garden to grow smaller. This walled and guarded space no longer needed, as the world blooms with daisies and dandelions, orchids and sage, sea lavender and flame lilies, belladonna and starflowers, a riot of life covering the earth, each one its own glory.
So January CEO episode, those are the episodes only available on Patreon, was written all by AI. So if you want to check out that episode and see just how good an AI is at talking about itself, check out our Patreon. But for now, here is the after show, written by artificial intelligence. And that's a wrap for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in and for all the support you've shown for our show. We couldn't do this without you, and your continued support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to see more, be sure to sign up for our Patreon, where you'll have access to exclusive content, early access to new episodes, and much, much more. And again, I must insist, we can't wait to bring you along with us on another recording for great content in the future. Until next time, farewell. That had bits and pieces of what I usually say, but it's not me. So I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 10. Alrighty, see you next time for some more interesting bullshit. Maybe about the bullshit within forensics television. Ta-ta!